Hey everyone, my name is Chris Anderson and I'm in Cuyahoga Valley National Park. You wouldn't know it from the rolling hills and forests along the Cuyahoga River, but this park is just down the road from Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, making it a quick getaway for city folk looking to get their nature fix. But the Cuyahoga River wasn't always this beautiful. Not that long ago, this was one of the most polluted rivers in the country. Instead of beaver and otter along its banks, there'd be industries dumping all sorts of pollution. People wouldn't even get close to the water, let alone kayak or fish here. Now, this is one of the most visited national parks in America and home to a resilient aquatic ecosystem. So how did the Cuyahoga River bounce back to become a refuge for wildlife and people? Let's find out today on OutSCIder Classroom. Welcome to Cleveland, Ohio. I grew up not too far from here, and you know what? I am darn proud of where I'm from. But anytime I tell someone I'm from Cleveland, I inevitably get the question, hey, is your river on fire? As if that's the only thing we're known for. I mean, we're the birthplace of rock and roll. LeBron James, Kid Cudi, Chef Boyardee. Both Cleveland and Akron are great cities. But admittedly, yes, our river has caught on fire. A couple times actually. But the fact the river caught on fire is like the least interesting thing about Cleveland. Why the river caught on fire and why no other rivers in America catch on fire anymore? Now that is a story worth telling. Northern Ohio is part of the industrial Midwest. Beginning shortly after the end of the Civil War, the steel and rubber industries in Cleveland and Akron respectively put thousands of people to work producing the raw materials needed to build the buildings, cars, and planes of the 20th century. My grandpa actually made cars for General Motors right here in town. These industries put a lot of people to work and gave them a middle-class lifestyle while building all the infrastructure that we enjoy today. However, those same industries also dumped a lot of pollution into the Cuyahoga River. There was oil refineries, a shipbuilding site, steel mills, a paint factory, all discharging hundreds of millions of gallons of wastewater from their industrial operations and sewage from their workers into the river for the better part of a century. So polluted was the Cuyahoga that it caught fire not once, not twice, but 13 times between 1868 and 1969. Basically, every 10 years or so, there would be so many chemicals in the water that a wayward spark would set it ablaze. There weren't even any fish living in the stretch of river between Akron and Cleveland. Not even like the three-eyed fish from The Simpsons. Yikes. The last time the Cuyahoga River caught on fire was 1969. I wasn't there, but Tim Donovan was. Tim worked at the steel mills at the end of the 60s and has since become an environmental activist. Tim, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So what was it like working in the steel mills close to the Cuyahoga River when it was so polluted?
I worked on the labor gang, so I was here, there, and everywhere. But I made my way to one of the better jobs, and one of the better jobs there was being on the docks and helping to unload the ships right on the river. And they instructed when you got there, they said, here's the deal, whatever you do, don't fall in the river. And if you looked at that river, you'd understand why they would tell you that. It bubbled like a cauldron, and it had things that would float by that were unrecognizable. Later on, they tell me that, no, that wasn't a dog that you saw, that was a rat that was blown up, by virtue of being in that river. So yeah, it was a scary little place to be. There are pictures throughout the history of the Cuyahoga that show people who had dipped their hands into the river and came out, and their hands would be all black with the oil that was floating on the top of the surface.
God.
Yeah, that's pretty nasty stuff, yeah. And you gotta realize it wasn't necessarily the river that was on fire, it was like the associated wooden debris. There was a wooden trestle there. So the wooden trestle is coated with oil over time. And that's, they surmise that a spark from the wheels that were going over the river is what caused the flame to ignite there at that point.
So how did the community organize around this, the river catching on fire for the 12th or 13th time? How did they use that as a springboard to start cleaning up the river?
The difference here was you had a new mayor, the first African-American mayor of a major city in America, Carl Stokes, a brother who served in Congress and served on a committee that was looking at two pieces of legislation that were very instrumental to solving the problem, the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act. And they saw an opportunity to use this fire to gain publicity and to engage the public in terms of that dialogue. So Lou invited Carl to come to Washington and testify. You ever hear the old saying, that'll take an act of Congress? Well, it did, and we did. We mustered up the lobbying necessary. We got all kinds of support from all 58 different municipalities and townships. It wasn't a lot of fighting, it was a lot of let's get together and good group hug here. What do you think?
Very collaborative.
Yes, very much so. Now you have wildlife all the time here. Bald eagles, deer, otters, egrets, you got the whole array here, yeah. This is sacred ground for us. This is where the canal pours into the river. This is the western boundary of America at one point, right behind us, this river. So yeah, there's a lot of integrated stories to be told here. Stories that not only are Cleveland stories, but America's stories.
Tim, thank you again so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks to the work of environmental activists like Tim Donovan, Carl and Lou Stokes, and hundreds of other members of the Northeastern Ohio community, 1969 was the last time the Cuyahoga River caught fire. In the months that followed, Congress passed the largest slate of conservation legislation in U.S. history. This included the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which enforces our nation's environmental standards. It also includes the Clean Water Act of 1972, which sets standards for water quality, gives grants and resources to communities trying to clean up their watersheds, and punishments for polluters. And finally, the Endangered Species Act, which protects endangered species from hunting, poaching, and habitat destruction. These are some of the most important pieces of environmental law ever, and it happened because the people of Cleveland and Akron worked together to make a difference. Thanks to them, we now know the human and environmental costs of polluting our waterways. Check out this wetland. Wow. It's pretty beautiful, right? Well, up until the mid-1980s, this place was a dump. I'm not talking about when your room's really messy and your mom's like, this is a dump, clean your room up. This was a literal dump with chemicals and solid waste like ink, paint, solvents, herbicides, pesticides, all leaching into the soil and getting into the Cuyahoga watershed. Ugh. In 1985, the national parks bought this property and found out pretty quickly it was home to a slew of toxins like dioxin, arsenic, and polychlorinated biphenyls, all of which have been known to cause cancer. Park rangers would get headaches or even rashes just by visiting the site. Not exactly the pristine wilderness that comes to mind when you talk about the national parks, huh? So how do you clean up 46 acres of a former dump that is filled with industrial sludge? The same way you walk around holding in a fart, very carefully. Since the soil had been contaminated by chemicals leaking from metal drums, it had to be removed and taken to a licensed facility where it could be stored and processed. Topsoil ranging from depths of 12 inches all the way to 25 feet below the surface were dug out with construction equipment. In all, around 400,000 tons of contaminated soil was taken away from the site. The land also had to be reshaped and graded to allow for water to drain into the wetland. Once the land was ready, the next step was to reestablish native plants. Native grasses, shrubs, and wildflowers, all of which are adapted to the wet soils of a wetland and the climate of Ohio, were planted throughout the site, with food and shelter now available. Everything from river otters to white-tailed deer and great blue herons now call this area home. None of that work was possible without a little scratch. You can't expect a backhoe operator to dig out a wetland for free, can you? Well, that's where all that environmental legislation that folks like Carl Stokes and Tim Donovan helped pass come in awful handy. Several companies were found responsible for dumping their refuse at this site by the EPA and were forced to pay for the cleanup to the tune of $50 million, the largest cleanup in national parks history. Not only did all that legislation pass in the wake of the last fire, clean up the Cuyahoga River and prevent companies from polluting the water, it also provided the resources to restore this former chemical dump into the wetland we see today. And that's just one of hundreds of stories from across America. Cuyahoga Valley is a great park to visit. You can bike on the Ohio and Erie Canal towpath or kayak on the Cuyahoga River. There's also great hikes where you can explore beautiful waterfalls and other cool geologic features. When you do visit, remember what it took to get this park looking as beautiful as it does today. Remember your no trace principles and make sure you take anything out of the park that you brought with you. Conservation is about organizing your community, lobbying elected officials for resources, and pushing for change. But most of the time, it's really about rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty, and picking up trash. What about where you live? You don't need a multi-million-dollar federal grant to start taking care of your local watershed. You just need the same hard work and attitude that the people who cleaned up the Cuyahoga River from open sewer to beautiful aquatic habitat we get to enjoy now. You'll be making a big difference, not just for wildlife, but for people too. Want to learn more about our national parks? Then hit that subscribe button, friend. Stay up to date and catch bonus features by following us on Instagram @OutSCIder.